Salutations, everyone, and welcome back to another Total Warhammer 3 guide. I'm Lord Forwind, and today we are covering the Tzeentch faction, Kairos Fate Weaver, in obviously the Immortal Empire's beta. So, this video will be divided into several different chapters, all of which should be linked below, so you can simply click to what section you want to see. We'll first go over the faction concepts, how they play. We'll go further into their units, talk about their economy, and then their technology. And then we will go over their lords and to some degree their starting location and strats. I'll talk more about that because it'll be unusual once we get there. And anyway, let's get right into it. So, Kairos Fate Weaver is arguably one of the most complex and strange factions to play. You're one of the mono god demon factions. You follow Tzeentch, and I'm sure I'm saying that one wrong to some degree. Anyhow, you have several different mechanics. The first ones you share generally with the other Chaos factions. You have the Great God, which periodically one of the four Chaos gods will gain ascendancy, and then you'll get various bonuses to your faction. Manifestations and stuff like that. If you get larger and more powerful, or your faction is leading, the more likely that your Chaos God will be ascended. And that comes into play with your unholy manifestations. You can use this to get various different effects. As your chaos corruption builds up across the whole world, not just your territory, you will unlock various unholy manifestations. So if you spread really far and then you collapse, you will then lose access to them. So the first one, upon completion, you get grimoires. So we'll talk more about them. Suffice to say, this is a pretty useful one if you've got nothing else going on to do. This next one causes attrition for one turn on the enemies. This is quite nice if you need to weaken an invading army or stuff like that. Next one, Magic Flare, boosts to barriers and range. This is really powerful on your range units, and we'll go over that a little bit more, or at least the concepts behind it. And then finally, huge boost of wind to magic per turn, huge loss of control in the enemy province, and a huge boost in Tzeentch corruption. Basically, if you use this, there's a really good chance the enemy province will revolt and become heavily corrupted to your side. It's great. Just be aware, there is a cooldown of 15 turns on all of these. So you're not going to be able to spam them as much as you might like. So let's talk briefly about the changing of the ways. And this kind of goes into Kairos Fate Weaver's unique currency. These are grimoires. Grimoires, if you don't know, are spellbooks, basically. It's an old-fashioned name for them. Warhammer tends to use some of these. Basically, you get them from either battling, buildings, characters, events, your standard stuff. You can also get them from unholy manifestations, and early on, that will probably be one of your best sources. Some buildings you may build, specifically resource buildings, will give you a good income from grimoires rather than an actual resource. Now, there are some other buildings that will help and boost that as well, but suffice to say, this is an actual good use for a resource building. You want these grimoires because you can use this changing of the ways, and there's a variety of different abilities you have, most of which require you to research technologies, so we'll talk a little bit more about those under the technology section. Suffice to say, you can do stuff like reveal where the faction's going, their armies. Figure out where an army can see and what their movement is. I don't use this one that much. This next one, you can have every faction's movement stopped. This is really useful if the enemy's trying to run reinforcements around and you want to stop their invasions or prevent them from saving a settlement that you're sieging. Next one, break alliances. You can ruin alliances between two factions. Then you get to select which factions you want. Reveal Shroud, you get to see all the lands of that faction. Can be very handy to learn vast amounts of the land. You can discover the map almost better than anyone else, which is quite cool. Be aware these do have cooldowns. The next one is you open a gate in a settlement wall. So capital settlements or high-level garrisons makes, if you command the battles, much easier because you can simply rush in and not have to siege or break down gates. Next one, this will allow war coordination. Honestly, you can kind of use the alliance mechanic to do this as well, but anyway, kind of cool here. This allows you to coordinate other factions as well. Force war, you start a war. Pretty normal. And then the last one here, and this one is pretty powerful. You have transfer settlement. If you click on a settlement, you can then therefore transfer it to you or another faction. Usually you're going to be transferring it to you, knowing how most people play. Be aware that it does have a large grimoire cost, and it changes based off the relations between the target faction. If they're lower, it's easier to affect. And if your corruption is high in the province, it's easier. Now, you cannot do that to anyone's last settlement, and you cannot do it, as far as I am aware. Well, you definitely cannot do it to Wood Elf settlements, first off. And I think there are a handful of other settlements that you can't do it as well, but you can never do it to a faction's capital. And thankfully, most legendary lords and everybody start with their best settlement being their capital. So don't expect to just waltz in and snipe Castle Drakenhof from Vlad or Isabella, for example. And that is the changing of the ways. This really makes this faction very complex, especially if you're going to try and play this faction in multiplayer. Everyone will either love you or they will hate you, depending on your manipulations. And that goes right along with Tzeentch's Chaos God of knowledge, changing, chaos, and everything else. All told, the ones I tended to use the most were either Break Alliance, Transfer Settlement, or Force Rebellion. Now, be aware, Force Rebellion is not very successful a lot of the time, but what it can do is it can cause the enemy army to leave a settlement to go fight the rebellion, or you start it elsewhere, they have to move an army to deal with the rebellion or stop an invasion, or if you just want to cause chaos, it's a fun one to do. I've never needed really open gates. Reveal Shroud is nice. Reveal factions' intentions can be pretty powerful at times as well. Force War is just hilariously fun to use, especially if you can pull it off on allies. It does give you a very nice breakdown of the relations and corruption stuff here. By and large, you're going to be spending a lot of grimoires if you want to change stuff. I mean, it can be in the thousands. So building up a good pile of grimoires is very important. The next one is, and this is one that really stumps a lot of people, is this Winds of Magic manipulation. And while I can't demonstrate it fully, because at this point in this save file, we have not got second provinces, two more provinces. But suffice to say, you can lower and you can raise the Winds of Magic. Now, this will allow spellcasters in those regions with high Winds of Magic to get more spell. It can also weaken enemy spellcasters. Be aware that as a demonic faction, based off your Winds of Magic, you suffer penalties when they're low, and you get bonuses when it's high. So if it's high, more movement, better barrier. Once it's low, reduce casualty replenishment, leadership, and, most annoyingly, low physical resistance. Suffice to say, you're going to be using this to move Winds of Magic around the map to help your invasions, your defense, and, extremely importantly, to support your economy. And we'll get into that more in the economic section. Now, those are the major things for this faction. Therefore, we can move right along now into units, of which Kairos has a fair grouping of. Here's all their units. We're going to go about it through the building browser so you can see which building enables which unit. So your default settlement here, you have an option between two. You can have a dimensional tier or you can have a soul keep. What's the difference, you might add? Because by and large, it's mostly the same. Suffice to say, one spreads corruption to neighboring provinces, one does not, but it is cheaper to build buildings there. Infrastructure buildings there. That is the largest one. One gives more control, one does not. Stuff like that. By and large, garrisons are the same, even at the highest levels. So picking which ones you want, it's more, do you want cheaper infrastructure or do you want to spread your corruption? Offhand, I tend to like the one that spreads the corruption personally, because it can cause havoc on your enemies. And in fact, unlike most factions, Tzeentch can get the corruption high enough to actually spread into enemy provinces, even if they have corruption reduction. So, your first starting units here, you have access to the Blue Horrors of Tzeentch. This is despite the very low stats, this is actually a half decent unit. It has low to medium, well, it has medium range, I would say. And it has very low ammunition, but what it does is it fires a flaming attack. And once it hits, it causes damage. And then if you fight in combat, it's both flaming and magic. It can be very powerful because you'll hit the enemy with it a couple times before you close into combat. While the combat stats aren't that great, the missile damage is decent. So if you get forecasts off early on, the average enemy you're fighting, you're going to have an advantage against. Now, the other thing is, each factions have barriers. And the barrier is a good chunk of their health. If you look up here, you can see what it is. A barrier on an 8,000 unit is 1,400. In combat, they lose the barrier, then they will lose health. If you're not in combat and taking damage, the barrier will regenerate. This is why something like this Unholy Manifestation, adding range and barrier points, can be very powerful on on one of Kairos' armies, just because increased barrier means these units basically gain a huge boost to hit points and everything else. There's other ways to boost that, and we'll talk about a bit more of them later on. So outside of that, you have access to Chaos Furies of Tzeentch. Now, this is actually, in my opinion, one of the better Chaos Furies. It does magic damage, but the big thing is it has the barrier. So you can throw it into combat, have it beat something, and because it's a flying unit, you can then escape with it much easier than some of the other Chaos factions. The barrier will rebuild, and then you can throw it in combat. It's kind of like if you get your own miniature outside of combat health regen. Obviously, without the health regen. You also have access to the Marauders of Tzeentch, which is your basic Marauder Spearman unit. You're really going to use this to oppose enemies with Cav. Or early on, it might be your front line, and behind it, you stick your blue horrors or other horrors. So we'll talk about that a bit more. The level 2 Servants building, which is one of your two basic buildings. One focuses on demons, one focuses on humans. The next level is your pink horrors. Now, this is just in general a upgrade from the blue horrors. It is more expensive, and it requires a building, but it has significantly more ammunition, much better range, and it has very annoying flaming and magical attacks. And you're going to want to use a lot of these in your early game armies. If they get into combat, they will probably die, but they shouldn't get into combat with anything they haven't already damaged. They're also demons. Most of these are demons, so just be aware if they start losing a battle, they collapse. But they do get physical resistance, which is very handy. And then at the top, you get the iridescent horrors and an exalted pink horror. So the iridescent horrors are hero units. They are magic spellcasters. They start unusually for a spellcaster with a range ability. Most spellcasters in the game tend to be either spellcasters or melee fighters, or tend not to be melee fighters or ranged ones, just spellcasters. This is a bit of an exception. They're still decent in melee combat, but the big thing is they can bombard you from range with spells, and they can bombard you close up with warp fire, which is basically all this stuff that the Tzeentch factions use. Warp fire is kind of crazy. When you use it, it will cause a weakness to fire damage and armor, therefore allowing these flaming ammunition attacks to do even more damage. If you wanted a faction that's anti-undead, Tzeentch is probably one of the better ones because basically everything has a flaming attack. It's kind of funny. So you got access to metal and Tzeentch's actual magic tree, of which I tend to like magic better, but Tzeentch has its own place in the game. And your exalted pink horrors are pretty much an upgrade from your normal pink horrors. Overall, they do more damage. They have slightly better combat stats, and they're more expensive to build and maintain. This is going to be your core of range. Oddly enough, for a chaos type faction, Tzeentch has a lot of range units. In fact, has a very strong range game against everybody who does not outrange them. So someone like the Wood Elves, some of the High Elves, and the like with long range abilities, or tons of artillery prove a horror for Tzeentch, but everything else in between, basically, between super powerful melee and long range, that's the sweet spot for Tzeentch. So factions that don't have the best range, but also don't have the world's best melee. The next building line we have here is your mortal servants. So these are humans, so they don't have that collapsing demonic ability. They all have barrier, which is nice, except for the fact that a lot of Tzeentch's melee infantry are, shall we say, lacking. Even with barrier, it doesn't solve the fact that they're not super strong. The barrier on these guys, for example, 9,360, is actually pretty low. Just be aware that when you look at this initially, it only gives the hit points, not the barrier. So some of these units here, oh, it's got little hit points. And then you look at it and its barrier is huge. Just pointing that out. So Marauders, this is your base shielded melee infantry unit. If you're going to fight melee, they're better than the Marauders of Tzeentch at killing things, but the Marauders of Tzeentch are tankier and will hold longer in melee combat. Here they are again, right next to it. Kind of odd they show up 2 places, but that's because if you go to a minor settlement, you don't get them to start with. Just pointing that out. And then the last one here is the Forsaken. This is actually a melee unit that will actually kill things, unlike these two, which tend to hold the line while you use pink horrors and the like to bombard them from a distance, the enemy. It's a decent melee unit. It's a damage dealer, so you throw them into combat, they're going to do some decent damage. Just be aware, they're not going to last the longest in melee combat, but if they're not constantly being attacked, as in if they get a flank or they're fighting something like the Skaven, they will hold their own, and in fact, they will butcher the enemy. If you can find a way to cycle them in and out of combat, charge in, do damage, and then pull them back without being chased, you can extend this barrier a lot longer, and they become much more effective. The reality is good Tzeentch players are very good at cycling their units so that one unit is taking damage with a barrier, while a unit without a barrier is starting to get some regen on it. And of course, there are ways to affect the barrier. Moving further on, we have access to Tzeentch's Chaos Spawn, which is your pretty standard Chaos Spawn. Does magic attacks, though, and sunders armor. Overall, it's a very needed, strong melee line unit for Tzeentch's armies. You throw it into the enemy, it's unbreakable, so it will tie them up for quite a while. It's got a barrier, but their barrier is rather pathetic. It's a great unit to use to hold the enemies back while you hit them from a distance with Warp Flame. Next ones, we have access to the Marauder Horseman. So this is a rather strange unit. It's your pretty standard Marauder Horseman, but it has Warp Flame missiles, which is quite interesting. So the reality is you actually want to use this. Normally I talk down the Marauders, but this one is actually a decent unit. If you can hit it with Warp Flame on the enemy, then you can start getting some of these further damage over here and from the blue horrors and stuff, and you can really stack the damage rather quickly. Plus, it's a fast skirmishing unit that does fire and magic range attacks. I mean, you can't ask for much better than that. Be aware it's going to die to any archers, but it's worth bringing a couple of them, at least early game, to do damage. Being a tier 1 infantry, tier 1 cav unit is not entirely accurate to the effectiveness on the battlefield of these. Just be aware that if they get caught, they're going to die in melee combat really fast. Next one, we have the Chaos Warriors of Tzeentch. Now, this is pretty much just a flat upgrade from the Marauders. It is a significant boost. It's got better defenses, better attack. Overall, once you get this, you should never use the Marauders of Tzeentch ever again. You want the Chaos Warriors. Further up, we have access to more magic users, Chaos Sorcerer of Metal and Tzeentch Chaos Sorcerer. So this is just a variation on these. They have slightly different abilities and skill trees. It's really up to you which one you want to focus on using. Um, I have a particular fondness. Um, oops, let me get over here. I have a particular fondness for. Oh, I don't actually have it at this point in the game. I have a particular fondness for the horror ones, just because they have the range attack on top of the fighting and melee combat. While the chaos sorcerers are better fighters, the addition of a range attack allows these units, once you run out of magic, which takes a while, to actually still be effective on the battlefield. Whereas these guys, once you run out of magic, they have to go to melee combat usually, where they're less than effective. They've low hit points and a very low barrier. Staying out of the way, hitting it from range, I find to be much more useful. Now, from the Chaos Warriors of Tzeentch, we get an upgrade to Halberds. The big difference here is no shields. On the other hand, you get a very needed armor penetrating melee unit. It's really up to you which ones you want to stick with. This is one of those times where the melee defense from the Halberds does not exceed the Chaos Warriors one. So overall, if you want to hold the line, it's really up to you which one you pick. There's no real wrong decision here, except one is armor piercing and the other is not. So just be aware of that. Further up here, we have the Chosen of Tzeentch. This is your standard Chosen unit, but for Tzeentch. With a barrier, it's actually a half decent barrier amount. It basically is a 1/10 health increase. This thing is really solid in melee combat. They're going to butcher most infantry units left alone, especially if you can somehow pull the enemy off of them temporarily. They're best used if they can get into combat with a unit they can easily beat in melee combat, because then once they beat that unit and it's routing or is dead, their barrier will regen and then you can throw them into the next fight. They don't do very well in long drawn out fights against equal level infantry. They're much better at butchering weak infantry and then turning to fight equivalent level infantry that has been weakened by fighting your weaker infantry. Basically, that is a very good strategy as Tzeentch. Use your strong unit to kill their weak units, where the barrier comes into more effect, and then go toe to toe. Obviously, that relies on your units that are fighting their strong units to not die instantly. Further on up here, we have access to the Chosen with Halberds. So this is actually another strange thing, because both units do magic damage, which is quite strong anyway. This becomes armor piercing. Use it against cav or heavily armored enemies. But the reality is, even these guys do decent against armored enemies with the magic attacks, which is quite nice. And then finally, we have access to the Doom Knights each. So this is a flying cav unit. It's kind of like some of the elite Empire or Bretonians. It flies, it does decent damage, it's got a good barrier. It does not have the world's greatest hit points, but if you drop it on archers or artillery, it's first off going to get to them because it has a barrier. Then it's going to be able to kill them. Then if you get them in the air, you can regen the barrier. And then you can charge in again and again and again. Just be aware, it does not do very well in prolonged melee combat, which proves to be, it makes it a little bit less effective than other cav units. The next ones we have access to are the Fiery Servants. So these are flying units. Tzeentch actually has a pretty strong flying tree. I suspect it was created to fight Cathay in the Souls Race mode, but they're okay. These ones are not overwhelmingly amazing. They fly. They have decent to low combat stats. They're really good at killing archers. Other weak flying units, like they will tear through any Chaos Furies anyone else deploys against you, but don't expect to drop them in the enemy and have them actually succeed. For that, you want to get to the Flamers Siege. So this is a monstrous missile infantry unit. You're not flying anymore, be aware of that, but you've got a long, well, medium range ammunition attack. Low ammunition, but very powerful missile strength. it will put Warp Flame on them, so then the next attack will stack for even more damage. Couple of these left alone can absolutely ruin your enemy's day. And then once they're done, they actually do Warp Flame in melee combat. So as long as they get a missile attack off on the enemy prior to fighting, they're actually going to be doing more damage than you would expect. Their combat stats are horrendous though, so try not to let them get in melee combat. That's the job of your human servants, to be the front line and die. These guys, their job is to absolutely destroy enemies. Be aware though that if the enemy has long-range archers, wood elves, high elves, etc., you're going to really struggle fighting them because they will hit you from a long range. And these barriers are not the world's greatest, so you will struggle. Now, you've got exalted ones, which, if you look at the difference in missile strength, is massive. Also, the range goes up. Now, be aware that this is 12 units. This is 1. Overall, though, the Exalted Flamer is a much better unit, in my opinion. You still do warp damage. You have slightly better melee combat stats, but the sheer damage your missiles can do is considerable. 1 or 2 of these left alone can easily wreck enemy heroes or enemy archers. Plus, you're no longer outranged, which is really nice. Overall, once you get this, these are going to be your elite range units for some time. And finally, at the top, you have the Burning Chariots of Tzeentch, which, although these units are very strong, these guys are flying. They have a lower range. They're not a straight upgrade, let me be clear about that. But they fly and they shoot down, which is quite nice, so you can almost always get attacks off, so you don't have to worry about arcs or straight firing lines. And if they do go in melee combat, they're actually pretty decent. They've got a okay barrier. They're a chariot, though, so what they will do is they'll charge around, knocking the enemies back, making this unit way more better in combat than its melee stats would indicate. It's very powerful. Don't be fooled by these weak stats, and don't overestimate how strong it is in range. It's pretty good in melee combat as well, especially against trash units. Against trash infantry units, it will just massacre them all day long. Moving on, we have access to the cultists. So this is, and I can actually show you this. So this guy starts with 1. That is this unit. It has access to fire spells. So if you want a fire caster, that's what it is. It's not entirely clear when you hover over it. It doesn't say like Cultist of Tzeentch Fire, but that's what it is. It's a fire caster. Further on up top, you have access to the Lord of Change, which is a very powerful flying, casting spellcaster monster, good in combat. You get other abilities that make this stronger, but the big thing it can provide is damage resistance and some bound spells that they can cast without using winds of magic to do so. Great unit. 1 or 2 in an army is all you're going to really need, but they're very powerful. Very powerful. Further on, we have access to the Forges of Change. So this is where things get a little bit strange. This is kind of it's kind of where you get the chariots, but you get some other stuff here too. So the big thing though is that this building also gives recruit rank and local recruitment capacity, which is really good because none of these others have that many benefits. So being able to raise more demonic armies is powerful. So you have Chaos Chariots. Again, it's a chariot unit, so it's more disruptive than actually killing. The stats are stronger than you would expect, and it does magic attacks, which is really nice. Plus, a barrier on a chariot unit actually makes a lot of sense because they can charge to disrupt the enemy, and a lot of times you can pull them out before they die, and then let the barrier regen and charge them in again. They have a really nice charge bonus. It's right up there with some of the Slaanesh flanking bonuses early game. Plus, you get it at level 3, which is quite nice. Further on, you've got the Chaos War Shrine. Now, why this is important, it provides leadership in an area, making your demonic and human units run away less. And this is a very nice one, it increases power recharge rate and spell mastery as nearby entities die. Meaning you want to park this right behind your front lines where it will keep your units fighting and give the biggest benefit possible to your allies. Basically, wherever you have the Chaos War Shrine on a map, you want your spellcasters nearby. Getting Winds of Magic and power back is really huge as Tzeentch. Further on, we have access to the Chaos Knights. So most Cav in this game is honestly weak right now and needs a bit of a rework. One of the exceptions is the Chaos Knights of Tzeentch. They're a solid Cav unit if you look at their stats. They're heavily armored. They've got a great charge bonus. You've got them with lances, which have a great charge bonus, or you have them without lances and with a shield and sword rather than a shield and a lance. One will do better in long-term melee combat. One's more about charging. In my opinion, take the ones with the lances. The charge bonus, the ability to charge in and then retreat with a barrier of 800 is huge. You charge in, you do damage, you pull it out, you regen the barrier, you charge in again. The only thing slowing you down is if the enemy has cav and they keep up with you, or you don't have enough time to let the barrier regen. And finally, at the top is one of the strongest units in the game at the moment, is the Soul Grinder Tzeentch. So Soul Grinders, or any of the Chaos factions, tend to be very strong. Tzeentch, on the other hand, gives a range and a pretty powerful missile strength. It basically functions as an artillery unit with a barrier, meaning if it doesn't die to enemy artillery or spells, it's surprisingly tanky. Now, it has low ammunition, which is kind of a pain, but it has good melee stats afterwards, so feel free to throw it into combat if you need to. And that is the Tzeentch tree of units. Let's quick wander over here to the spell browser, make sure we hit everything. It looks like we did. Some of these are regiments of renowned. Yep, I think we hit them all. They're very fun to use. Tzeentch has a lot of range. Not so great melee units. They're not bad, I'd say. All told, probably mid-tier melee units. More emphasis on staying alive than actually killing the enemies, where most of your killing is going to be done by your very powerful range units and spells. Tzeentch has a lot of spells and a lot of Winds of Magic for a reason. You should be spamming spells on the enemy every battle. In fact, most enemies that fight you, especially in like multiplayer, are going to want to take magic resistance or ways to mess up your spell casting because they hurt. They really hurt spell casting. It's not a very beginner friendly faction just because of all the different mechanics and spells, but once you learn it, it's considered the strongest of the Chaos Gods right now. Okay, let's talk about the economy. And Tzeentch's economy is strange. So first off, you've got a low level port. You don't make a lot of money from your ports. You make almost no money whatsoever from your resources building. Now, on the other hand, resource buildings boost all income in the province by 50%, meaning it is actually worth building them because they combo very well with your other buildings. So overall, Tzeentch has a pretty good garrison, and you're going to want to build that in all your settlements. Be aware that, of course, you have to get to a level 3 garrison in order to get walls on it, but it gives some surprisingly powerful spellcasters and overall makes you one of the more defensively successful Chaos factions, especially because you have barriers, meaning if the enemy doesn't kill you when they climb your walls and you fight them off, your barriers will regen before the next wave arrives, at least to some degree. So I definitely recommend quite a few walls where you can. Overall, standard anti-Skaven plague building, not the biggest need for Tzeentch. Now, there is, of course, a difference between a capital settlement and a minor settlement buildings. So let's look at the 3 buildings that are the same, and then we'll talk about the difference. So the first building here is a control building. Kairos Fateweaver has, honestly, a blue line that gives public order. So public order as Tzeentch is not the biggest problem. It can still be worth building one of these just to make sure you have absolutely no revolt and high public order, because obviously you get benefits. It also, oddly enough, provides a huge line of sight. Stacked with the control bonus line of sight, you can have probably the longest line of sight settlements in the game. It's just an odd thing to have there. Over here, this is your income building, income and growth. You'll notice it's not amazing, 200, but you'll see that under both of these buildings, and in fact under all of these, there is it when Winds of Magic is strong or higher. This refers to, of course, the winds of magic, which you can see if you just hover over the province. In this case, winds of magic are weak. But remember, we can manipulate the winds of magic at will. So we can strip winds of magic from lands we control and move it to other areas. This can be quite powerful for building your income. You basically are going to want one or two regions in your lands that have high winds of magic for basically the whole game, and they will supply you money. All told, it's almost a 50% income increase if you have high winds of magic. Combine it with the income from buildings and the last building here, which we'll talk about, and you can make some pretty decent money. Unlike a lot of the other Chaos factions, your economy isn't as awful. You can actually make some money from buildings rather than having to fight and raid, the standard demonic economy and stuff. The next one here is a growth building. The reason I mentioned the strong garrisons, not only because you should build them, is because of this building. This one increases the barrier replenishment rate by 33%. Now, this applies to your armies, but it also applies to your fighting garrisons or units inside a city. This barrier replenishment rate is huge. It basically doesn't quite double the effectiveness of your barriers, but I find it makes your army way more tankier. Um, it's huge. Even if you get a second of regrowth of your barrier, it comes into effect. And long term, if you're fighting in a city where you might rout multiple enemies and then wait for the next wave, makes your army way, way more defensive. All told, you can have one of the strongest defensive armies if you use it properly and your units actually survive. It also, if the winds of magic are strong, gives you more growth. Again, you're going to want the winds of magic to be strong, but it's nice that it allows you to then develop a province at 90 growth a turn. If you have this, 105, and make more money. It's a great building. It's worth throwing down where you can. I wouldn't necessarily put it in minor settlements, but major settlements can be worth it. This Weave of Time, you want to build in all your major and minor settlements. You need the income. This one, it's up to you where you build it, but considering in a minor settlement you're going to be sticking a garrison, you start with one, you get the income, you've got a choice really between the other three, and the reality is you want to pick this third one. So this is the minor settlement one. This spreads a huge, this is a massive 12 corruption in your province. And yes, it spreads to adjacent provinces as well. But the big benefit is income from all buildings plus 30. It's huge. If you have this and you have this, you're going to be making a lot more money than you'd expect. You're going to be making almost 400. It's a really powerful stacking one. Honestly, between your starting building, your garrison, your income, and this, you're going to fill up most of your minor settlements. Most of your unit production should take place at major settlements as each. That happens that way with most factions, but it's a little bit more pressing here. But be aware, you can build up a half-decent army just using these exalted pink horrors from minor settlements. They're only level 3, and they're a top-line unit. For a major settlement, the fourth building is replaced by a library building. You're going to want to build this in every major settlement you get. First off, huge resource rate and a boost of income from buildings, and most importantly, it gives you grimoires per turn. If the winds of magic are strong, it gives you 14 per turn maxed out. This is huge. The more grimoires you have, the more chaos you can cause with changing of the ways. More settlements you can just steal from the enemy, or more havoc you can cause, forcing them to fight wars against people they wouldn't otherwise. Getting grimoires is an important thing. Now, I can't show you it right here, but Tzeentch, like other factions, gets cults. Be aware you can find cults by using the province tab. They show up around here. They will spawn in various areas. You can throw down 4 different cult buildings. The one that gives grimoires every turn is usually your best one. The other ones, 2 of them are trash, and the last one isn't that great either. Really early on, you want as many grimoires as you can so you can use all your effects and your abilities to your full potential. And basically, the trick with economy is make sure your winds of magic stay strong. You own a whole area, put on a nice edict, build the economy buildings, and make sure it stays strong winds of magic so you make tons of money from it. That's a pretty important thing with this faction, is the winds of magic. Now, And I'm realizing I missed this earlier, but we'll talk about this later. I missed one of the stances. Oops. So let's move on. So let's talk about technology. So each has 9 trees, all told. And 4, 4, and 3, more like 10 actually, to be honest. But whatever. Tzeentch's tree is kind of interesting. First off, you'll see technologies that are locked behind a certain amount of grimoires. This is why you want grimoires early on, so you can unlock these techs. And some are also locked behind buildings. Mostly high-level buildings. This one, the Cult of Change. Just be aware that is there, that you need it. It only locks a handful of techs, but they're pretty powerful. So you'll note right at the beginning you have access to probably the most starting techs of any faction that you can research, some of which are better than others, some of which unlock further techs. Arcane Surge here is a cooldown on all spells, can be useful. This one unlocks a Reveal the Shroud, which allows you vision over the enemy's lands for changing of the ways, and this one, Income from Saki and Looting. These ones can be researched whenever you want. They don't unlock anything particular. Not to say they're bad. The boost in income is really huge. The boost in cooldown is really nice as well. More spells all the way. And Changing of the Shroud, I think, is the weakest one. But if you want vision over the enemy to see where they're moving the armies and stuff, it can be very useful. Now, you've got different trees, and we'll kind of cover each of them together. So these are grouped together. This one, first off, you need to unlock Almatic Locus. Increases your Winds of Magic power reserve. This is very nice for a faction that's mostly about spell casting. It gives you more. Up here, Way of Scrying allows you to see what the faction's armies are doing, where they're headed to. This can be very useful. If you see the enemies are headed towards you, you can move to defend. Just be aware that there's probably better uses of your Changing of the Ways, but it's up to you. Further on here, your Screamers of Tzeentch get a bonus to charmed attacks, weakening the enemy when actually melee attacking them, and they get a boost on charge, which is quite nice. Way of Fates allows work coordination targets on enemy people who might be fighting the same enemies as you. Can be quite handy. Can also redirect enemies to attack areas you want them to. Eye collecting, huge income from rating boost. Be nice if you are rating. Honestly, by the time you get all the way down here with these 2 grimoire costs, you're probably not hurting that much for money. But if you do, it's a good tech. Iridescent Touch. Honestly, Tzeentch has no corruption problems whatsoever, meaning this is a less useful tech than you would imagine. Still has its purpose, but nothing amazing. This one, Word Seeker. This helps you construct libraries in your capital settlements more. Their construction time isn't the worst anyway, but if you want them faster, it's cool. But you're mainly going to be researching these to get to the bottom one. So the next one, cheaper construction, always a good thing. I particularly like this one. Further down, Lord Recruitment. Okay. The last one, Infernal Gateway, though, this is a bound spell for Lords of Change units. So if you remember, I spoke about them under the units as a single entity, powerful bound spellcaster. This provides it to them. It's pretty similar to the other Chaos Gods casting ability outside of Corinth. And the ability to cast a very powerful area effect spell and damage the enemies is really nice. If you can get to it, it's definitely worth snagging. This next tree here has several grimoire requirements, but I really recommend this is the first focus. So the first one is Gifts and Mutation. Cheaper recruitment is nice. It gives your Marauders and Marauder Horseman armor, meaning some of your base units are going to be tankier. But the big prize is moving on further. Way of Deceit allows you to force rebellions. Remember, the rebellions are not the strongest, but they have their purpose if used properly. If you go north, you'd get Glean Magic on Lords of Change. Be aware it requires a high level building and grimoire, so you're not going to get this early on. But basically, when you use this spell, you'll siphon off magic from the enemy and put it on yourself instead, which is cool. And then up top here, you give a massive ammunition and weapon strength to basically all your ranged units. Or your horror demonic units, not stuff like soul grinders or screamers. This is amazing once you get it. It makes your ranged units that you should have a fair amount of, even stronger. Now, if we progress further to the left, we get Transmutation of Ore, boost income from settlement buildings, really handy in making money. If you go north, here's an army ability, huge damage army ability that once you build up to it, you can cast. Sunder's Armor, which is really handy for helping your semi mediocre infantry units actually kill the enemy. And by and large, the ability to have a bound spell is nice anyway. If we go further down, and this is where things get interesting, you get a cheaper upkeep for your flamers and increased missile strength, which is nice. And then the one I recommend trying to get early on, Scatter Loci. Casualty replenishment in all armies, and recruitment capacity in all provinces. Overall, a very, very good tech. Early on, replenishment is something you can struggle with. This will help. And if we went south here, we would get cheaper recruitment and a passive ability for the blue and pink horrors. In fact, you might even consider going out of your way to snag this early on, because it helps with the power recharge of your units, which is cool. And it only works when they're out of combat, but since they are ranged units, they will not be in melee that much, so you'll get a benefit out of this. And if you were to go all the way to the bottom, be aware it's expensive. This is where you can force war between factions, which is huge. Now over here, you'll see these two bound ones. We'll touch about that. Teleport Stance, and I neglected to talk about it earlier, so this would be a good time to talk about it. It means your teleport stance cost usage becomes 0. So Kairos and your other lords have the ability to teleport. So what does this mean? Well, if we were to throw on teleport, you basically get access to the Underway. That's kind of what it does. I mean, that's kind of all it does. It costs Winds of Magic to use, though, which can be a problem if you don't have tons of Winds of Magic. But it will make it then free. Otherwise, kind of suffer functions like the Underway, which is nice. You'll see the difference in movement there. Overall, though, if you can move normally, it's cool. Otherwise, you can jump. Does not have the same description as the ambushing while using, like the Underway or Beast Pass or everything. But overall, is functionally almost the same. It's quite useful to jump around enemy defenses, avoid cities, jump mountain range. Again, increase the weird trickiness, craziness, chaoticness of Kairos. So getting that free is quite useful. Be aware, though, you have to research quite a few techs to get it. It's not just a simple thing. You need Temporal Switch. You need all these other ones scattered around the research tree. Way of Fate, Way of War, Way of Manipulation. It can take a little while to get to some of these because they're far down, which makes sense because this is one of your latest game techs. You'll see it takes 72 turns even if we were to focus it. Now, Fires of Change requires the Cult of Change. Basically, all your Lords of Change units, which are your units with bound spells, get an additional cast, doubles their combat capacity easily. Now, further on, we have access to this tree. So the locus of transmogrification increases the recruit rank of your base units, or your demonic units, I should say. Very useful. Early on, it can be worth snagging, making your blue horrors perform better in combat, but the big benefit comes in your pink horrors. Additional damage and stats are really good on powerful units, and this will help you get there. Further on, Way of Times allows you to track enemy armies. If you want to see that description, track enemy armies, you can see the enemy's line of sight. Or allies' line of sight. Doesn't necessarily restrict it to an enemy, I believe. And if you were to go north, you get armor on your Chaos Warriors chosen in Chaos Knights. Armor is always good. It means your units become even tankier, which is nice. If you go south, this is worth snagging if you're fighting, say, a Nurgle faction, but the odds of you fighting a Nurgle faction as Kairos in his current start is pretty low. Further on, Way of Manipulation stops the enemy armies from moving. If they're invading you, this will give you time to recover and regroup, and overall, it's kind of a cool one. So this one requires nothing on this tree, which is kind of interesting because it goes up rather than these ones going over and down. Just taming, Your Doom Knights get a recruitment cost reduction and a higher rank. As I said, Doom Knights are pretty good, so this helps. Persistent change, control in all provinces. As I said, Tzeentch does not have a lot of control problems. This is part of the reason why. Further up, Treason of Tzeentch gives another bound spell to your Lords of Change. You're starting to see that over time you build up the strength of your Lords of Change. Early on, they're still good, but they're not amazing. Late game, they become absolute monsters. Storm of Fire is an army ability. Large strike, bombardment damage is pretty useful once you get it. And then finally, Sanic Deviants income, and your Lord and Heroes have recruited a higher rank if they cast metal spells. Kind of nice. It's not something I'd prioritize early on, but the income boost is quite nice late game. Now, the next one we have is the Cult Whisperer growth. And if you're spreading corruption using your cultist hero units, additional corruption. Overall, though, I've not struggled with corruption as each. Initially, you struggle a bit, but once you get a couple buildings going, you corrupt the province rather quickly. Next one opens gates using changing of the ways. Further on here, recruitment rank for your iridescent horror heroes. It's kind of nice. It's not game changing though. But further on, break alliance can be. You can shatter alliances between very powerful enemies. Just be aware the cost be a large amount of your grimoires. Further on, your lords recruit higher, stacks pretty well with your champions have changed. Now your lords would be rank 6. Further on, cultists recruit higher. You want more fireball mages? Great. Endless mutation, your Forsaken and Spawn replenish faster. This can be quite useful since both of these units, one is unbreakable, the other is one of your stronger mid-game melee units. They tend to take damage, so the increased casualty replenish rate is quite nice on them. Further on, reduced upkeep of all your units, 3%. It's really nice, and you start to get some pretty powerful spell resistance, meaning your Forsaken and Spawn can no longer be killed efficiently with magic, meaning the enemies pretty much have to either shoot them or hack them to death, rather than blasting them from range, which, ironically, melee combat, hacking them to death is what they want. Further on, incredible demagoguery. Honestly, increased hero success rate. Come on, this is a pretty much useless tech. And the final one, another bound spell. This one is quite useful. You get your 3 rifts, it moves around, does warp flame, and it's a bound spell, so it doesn't cost magic to cast. Overall, Tzeentch is definitely one of the factions that thrives later on in the game. Once you get some of these spells on your Lords of Change, you start really casting spells constantly in combat, which is really fun. Okay, let's talk about Kairos Fateweaver and his start. So first off, Creative Assembly, people who make the game, have already said this is not going to be his long-term starting location. So giving you a step-to-step guide of how to expand from here is going to be useless. He's going to be jumped down here. My guess is he's either going to take Demon's Gate, or he's going to take one of these other provinces. Lost Palace is actually a pretty likely one because it's a capital settlement. It's not far away. Regardless, down here, you're going to be fighting other factions, one of which is a Nurgle faction, where the reduced spread of plagues could be handy. Overall, though, you can still crush them. You want to secure this area down south if you can. Oh, be aware that there is a lizard man lord who's all about his sanctums and purging chaos over here. He's going to be one of your bigger problems early game. After you would secure this lower area, which by the way is rather large, if you look over here, it does extend for some distance. You probably should move up here to where currently he starts. Taking Dawn's Light can be reasonably easy. It does not start with a garrison building or anything, meaning you can usually land and take it. Fortress of Dawn is a huge prize. If you can get it early, it's great. It will allow you to corrupt and have a decent defensive position. Be aware that Teclis of the High Elves lurks over here. Tic-Tac-Toe up here tends to come south unless he's killed by Manfred or the other. Krogar lurks over here. I think I got that right. He lurks over here. He can be very powerful if left alone. Thankfully, he starts on the other side of Teclis, but they start non-aggression pact, and sometimes will form alliances, in which case it could be a problem. Now, Teclis might move as well, in which case he might start over here, in which case you'd want to kill him sooner rather than later. He's one of the few factions that can match you magic spell for magic spell, basically. So let's look at Kairos and his special stuff. So first off, this is his faction trait. Since he's the only one, it's basically his traits. Battle reinforcement time lower. If you've got 2 armies, your 2 armies will appear on the battlefield before the enemy's reinforcing armies. Not a huge benefit, very niche. Hero success rate. How often do a lot of people use heroes? Only high-level pro players use heroes all the time, but you should start considering using heroes. They have a very good purpose. They can damage walls, they can harass, they can kill units. Can be very useful, and the increased success rate is nice, but not game breaking. So Kairos' stats here is an oracle. You get unique items that you can use to customize his spells, and we'll mention that more later. Enemies have a almost no success chance against you, and getting ambushed is extremely difficult as this guy, because he looks into the future and the past, but he cannot see the present. Two-headed, one sees past, one sees present. So Kairos is a demonic lord, meaning he's actually very powerful. Unlike the other demonic lords, legendary lords, he's terrible in combat. Let's just be honest. There's no really good way to get around this. These melee stats suck. Now, that's fine because Kairos is all about spells, and we'll get more into that later on. So Kairos has an entirely unique blue line to almost any other lord in the game. Route March is normal, but now you get into some strange stuff. First off, you can get +3 control in all your provinces. This is why I said Tzeentch faction here. Doesn't really have public order problems. Can be worth taking this if you are struggling, but overall, take it when you need it. Once you do, your public order problems kind of disappear for quite some time. Reckoning of Transmogrification reduces the cost of grimoires by up to 9%. I recommend taking this probably at the start. Grimoires are very precious. You won't have a lot of them early on, and a decrease in costs can be huge. Further on, guess what? Better chance of you ambushing people. If you're fighting enemies that you need to ambush, this is good. Otherwise, I'd kind of ignore it for some time. Binding of the Wills is interesting. It decreases the time of your changing of the ways. I don't recommend taking this early on, mainly because you won't have the grimoires to support using it every 12 turns versus 15, unless you're crazy focusing them. Next one, Lightning Strike here. Makes the enemies take longer, allows you to do lightning strikes. Be aware, you only need 1 point to get past this point. If you want to, throw 2 more points in it. It becomes very powerful, but the first level isn't amazing. Now, the next one is quite interesting. This one makes it free for you to see what a faction's intentions are for their army. Can be very powerful if used properly. The downside is it's not an amazing ability, really, and it uses up your changing of the ways there. 1 turn of it, at least. Scrolls of Destiny, I recommend snagging early on. The grimoires per turn is great, but the big bonus is the grimoires from all your buildings in the local province go up. If you get a library where you're getting 14, now that's 28 per turn, or 31, including this ability. This will solve your grimoire problem. The downside is you have to kind of stay in your own lands if you want a ton of grimoires. But considering Kairos is not the most aggressive early game faction, it has great purpose. And then, of course, we have Casualty Replenishment Rate. Get it? Casualty replenishment rate is rare and hard to come by. It's always worth snagging. Decrease upkeep is nice. Little bit less necessary than some other factions, seeing as your economy is still not great, but better than some of the other demonic factions. And again, Renowned and Feared is always worth snagging. Movement, rank, everything else. Pretty standard red line here. We'll point out Seer of Destiny and then Master of Fates gives a huge boost to leadership and melee defense in an area. It's got a decent effect range, unlike some of these. If you stand behind stand behind your lines when they're fighting with the enemy, can make your infantry units become much more tanky. Stacks nicely with your armor techs and barriers. Your unit suddenly can last a lot longer in melee with this. But I do not recommend pursuing this early on. This is more of a late game thing. Now, the interesting thing about the red line here is some of these techs, not all of them, but they will apply stuff like barrier boosts or resistances and stuff. This one here, the Accursed Horrors, an additional barrier missile strength might actually justify going into the red line for. The barrier increase is massive, but hey, additional hit points is additional hit points, basically, and it's regenable hit points. Plus, the missile strength early on can be really powerful on your range units if used properly. The rest of these, they're not game breaking. I'm not gonna lie. They're so-so, but the armor and attack on some of your powerful units can be very useful. Later on, honestly, these are semi-disappointing. The big stuff they provide is the missile and spell resistance. Okay, let's look at his top stuff. So, he hates Nurgle. Okay, great. He fights better versus Nurgle. What the heck is he doing in melee combat anyway that he needs more attack and weapon strength? Answer me that. He shouldn't be in melee combat. True, it's a nice bonus, but honestly is ignorable. Gaze of Fate. This one can be pretty useful. It's worth snagging. It locks an enemy in place, and it reduces their melee attack. This can allow your infantry to butcher them, or your range units to catch an enemy that was too fast for them, or you can use it to protect Kairos or someone else and get away with them. It's a 14-second duration, which is pretty nice. Invulnerable for change, yeah, missile resistance. Hidden in time is interesting. If you use it, you become unspottable and stalk. Don't use it when the enemy's on top of you, but if the enemy you can see is advancing on Kairos, throw it down, and he's got more time to run away. Since he can fly, he's even harder to spot than most enemies. It's kind of weird that he can hide in the air, but hey, what can I say? Next one's Oracle of Eternity. He gets a plus 40 barrier. So his barrier is already 1,000. Plus 40, it's almost 400 more. And Oracle of Eternity, he gets the ability to trigger an immense ward save. This is going to help him a lot from taking damage. Unexpected. Next one, Boost to Winds of Magic. Base miscast chance down 40%. Basically means you're never going to really fail at spells. This one is huge. I recommend this to probably be your first one when you race after Oracle of Eternity. Barrier replenishment delay down by 25. Your army becomes much more tankier as your barriers come up faster. Plus, they replenish faster. All told, is one of the best skills I think in the game. Now, barriers aren't amazing, but conceptually, the stats make this really strong. Wind Summoner. This one is very nice and probably worth snagging second. Basically, your Winds of Magic power reserve constantly increases this guy, and he becomes even harder to hit in melee combat. This means you should never run across the problem of not having Winds of Magic on this guy unless you've just wasted a ton with a teleport and spells. Regardless, helps you cast more spells, which is what this guy's about. Wounds of Change, boost a barrier to your Lords of Change, and cheaper Winds of Magic cost for your Lore of Tzeentch spells. Considering Kairos has quite a few of them, this will help you cast more of them. And finally, huge boost to barrier to your entire army, and Mastery of Elemental Winds for some of your units. So, and I can't get actually over there, but it basically increases your power regeneration rate, if I remember. When more than one unit share this attribute or in the same army, the power of spells cast is increased. It's very strong. Your spells become much more powerful than they appear to be at the start. Consider you'll get it on a lot of your units, the Horrors, the Lords of Change, and Cultists, basically your heroes and lords, is really nice. So in terms of spells, let's glance over this first. You have access to these arcane items. Basically, as you level them up, you can get these fragments, which you can equip. And when equipped, they change Kairos' spells to entirely different things. So if you wanted to play Kairos and have healing and shields, Shield of Thorns, yeah, you can do that. It's kind of cool. And more importantly, if you get it to the second level, you will get the passive ability, which for Lore of Life is healing while casting. In my opinion, this is probably one of the strongest fragments you can get. It does cost you Treason and Firestorm, but they're not. Firestorm is powerful, but Treason is not so game changing that that having the ability to heal and stuff isn't stronger. Some of these other ones, it's worth looking these over. A boost to armor penetration can be nice. Enemies who are flying get weaker. If you're fighting flying enemies, yeah, great. The other one here is this fragment of Ashki. I can never say this name. Flame weakness to the enemies is really strong since most of your army does magic or flame damage. This one, if you want more magic, cool, and more magic as well. Really, the two prizes here are the flames and the healing, in my opinion. Now, Tzeentch's actual starting spells here for Kairos are pretty good. You get the blue fire of Tzeentch, which does damage, does quite a bit of damage. Does warp flames, so you can stack it with some of your other units that do flame damage at distance to make them stronger. Pretty good. It's worth using several times. The cost is reasonably low at 7, so you should be able to cast it several times. Even more if you start getting stuff like this where it's discounted. Fires of Change, ward save on all your allies. Since you should be casting lots of spells, this is actually a very useful passive. Glean Magic, this is where you steal magic from the enemies. Really useful if fighting someone like Teclis who's going to be casting spells at you. This allows you to cast your spells at him instead. Treason of Tzeentch, I disparaged it earlier. It's not entirely accurate. It has its purpose. It massively weakens the enemy leadership and melee attack, allowing your infantry line to butcher them. Pink Fire of Tzeentch, this is going to be the one you're going to be using probably more than Blue Fire. It's a little bit easier to aim, in my opinion, because this is a magic missiles. This is a tier shape spell, so you can throw this on the enemies angled to hit all their units from behind, and you can absolutely wreck or damage entire units with this. Damage isn't the most amazing, but the fact that it applies warp fire and everything else and weakens armor is really nice. This one, if you're casting a spell, your cooldowns get lower. You can cast more and more spells. Further on, Tzeentch's Firestorm, huge rift, hits a lot of areas, decent damage, again provides warp flame. Combined with the pink fire of Tzeentch, these two abilities combo together can do some nasty damage. Infernal Gateway, huge vortex, we already talked about it, decent damage. Your miscast chance on these is a lot lower than they might appear because you basically never miscast. Further on, your standard magic ones. The Greater Arcane Conduit is really nice. You need 3 here. Get these 2. It's really up to which whenever you want. I would prefer the Winds of Magic, in my opinion. And that is Kairos Fate Weaver's skills and stuff. So, all told, he can fly, which is quite nice. Causes fear and terror, and is a siege attacker. Has a decent quest, actually, for once. Most of this is forgettable. Heroes, rank, corruption, blah, blah, blah. The base miscast spell chance, you're never going to miscast if you get all his stuff. The big thing here is Staff of Tomorrow can decrease your cooldowns. So if you spam a lot of spells, click this, your spells are back up. It allows you to throw out spells probably faster than anyone else in the game. Just make sure that you have the reserve of magic to support it. So that is Kairos Fate Weaver and all his stuff. I'm sorry I can't show you more of the start. I'm not going to remake the video when it changes unless it gets reworked in general. But suffice to say, most of this stuff is unlikely to change. Keep your Winds of Magic strong in your lands so you cast spells and your economy is up. Strip them from enemy lands or lands you're going to use. Use the Winds of Magic manipulation and changing of the ways to do so and cause havoc amongst the enemy. And overall, get those grimoires, cast those spells, cause chaos, and people to self-doubt and get lost in random labyrinths, which is kind of really creepy, in all honesty, the lore behind Tzeentch's stuff. And that's going to be it for this guide. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you did, leave a comment. I probably screwed up something with magic. I am aware of that. I am not the best at magic in this game. And enjoy. Very fun faction. And if you'd like to see more of these, do subscribe, ring the bell, leave a comment. If you want something explained better, try and let me know. I'll try and figure it out if I don't already know. So thank you guys all for watching. Bye for now.